Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey, not to the vibrant markets or the grand temples of ancient Egypt, but into a much more somber, often disturbing corner of their world. How ancient Egyptian funerals were terrible and more. You might imagine serene processions and dignified burials. But trust me, the reality of preparing for the afterlife was a messy, odorous, and often gruesome ordeal. A quick reality check. You, with your aversion to decaying flesh and internal organs, probably wouldn't last a single hour in an embalmer's workshop. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might think that once someone died in ancient Egypt, the process of preparing them for eternity was dignified and perhaps even beautiful. But the journey to mummification, especially in its initial stages, was anything but. This was the gruesome journey to mummification, where the immediate, unpleasant realities of preparing a body for embalming would truly assault your senses. Imagine yourself not as a mourner, but as an assistant in the embalmer's workshop, a place often located near the edge of the desert, far enough from settled areas to contain the smells. The air is thick with a cloying, sweet yet sickly odor of spices, resins, and something else, something unmistakably organic and decaying. You see the body of the deceased, perhaps a wealthy noble or even a pharaoh, laid out on a slanted embalming table, its surface made of stone or wood. The heat of the Egyptian sun, even if the workshop is shaded, would contribute to the rapid decomposition of the body, making the work a race against time. The first step in the elaborate 70-day mummification process began almost immediately after death. This involved a series of preliminary procedures designed to prepare the body for the more invasive steps. The body would be washed, often with water mixed with natron salt and fragrant oils. But this was more for ritual purity than true cleanliness. Imagine the tactile sensation of handling a recently deceased body, its limbs stiffening with rigor mortis, its flesh still soft in places. You would feel the coldness, the weight, the utter lifelessness of the human form. A common historical fact is that the embalming process was incredibly expensive and complex, reserved mainly for the elite and wealthy, while common people received much simpler, less elaborate burials. One of the less glamorous aspects, often overlooked, was the initial draining of fluids. While not as dramatic as the later evisceration, the body would naturally release fluids as it began to decompose. Imagine dealing with these unpleasant bodily emissions, the constant need to clean and wipe the table, ensuring the process remained as ritually pure as possible, despite the biological realities. The smells would be most intense at this stage, before the body had been fully desiccated by the natron. You'd hold your breath, or try to breathe through a piece of perfumed linen, but the stench would be pervasive, clinging to your clothes and skin. The embalmers, often specialized priests or skilled craftsmen, would work meticulously, but their environment was far from sterile. Imagine working with rudimentary tools, constantly exposed to biological fluids and decaying matter. The risk of contracting diseases from the deceased was very real, though not understood at the time. You'd witness men around you suffering from various ailments, perhaps attributing them to curses or divine displeasure, rather than the raw, biological dangers of their profession. Historians still debate the extent of specific medical knowledge possessed by embalmers versus their reliance on ritual and traditional techniques. However, their exposure to pathogens was undeniable. Even the simple act of positioning the body, preparing it for the next stages, required a certain detachment. You're manipulating a corpse, treating it as a vessel for the eternal soul, but its physical reality is stark and unsettling. The initial preparation set the grim stage for the more invasive and truly horrifying steps to come. It was a constant reminder that the grand journey to the afterlife began with a very messy, very human end. So, as you hear the distant echoes of ancient prayers for the dead, remember that the majestic process of ancient Egyptian mummification began with a gruesome, messy, and intensely odorous journey of preparing a human body for its eternal transformation. It certainly makes you appreciate modern funeral homes and their discreet, sanitized practices, doesn't it? For the ancient Egyptians, holiness came with a heavy, earthly smell. You've just been introduced to the grim, odorous initial steps of mummification, a truly unpleasant start to the journey to the afterlife. But the process quickly became far more visceral and stomach-churning. Now, prepare to experience evisceration, a messy, odorous art, where the embalmers meticulously, yes, and quite graphically, remove the internal organs of the deceased. Imagine yourself as an assistant in that embalmer's workshop. The cloying smell of decay, spices, and natron already assaulting your nose. The body, having undergone its initial preparation, now lies before you on the slanted embalming table, ready for the critical next step. This is where the true surgical work begins, all performed without any modern understanding of hygiene or pain for the deceased. Of course, the embalmer, often a highly specialized priest or skilled craftsman, would first make an incision. For the most common and expensive mummification method, this was typically a long cut made in the left flank of the body. Imagine the sight: a precise, deliberate cut into the flesh, opening up the abdominal cavity. This wasn't a clean, clinical procedure. The incision would expose the internal organs, and the smell, already strong, would intensify dramatically as the sealed-off bodily cavities were opened to the air. The internal organs, still warm to the touch as the process began soon after death, would present a grim, colorful tableau. A common historical fact is that the incision was often made by a specialized individual called a scribe of the house of life, or a slasher, who would perform the cut and immediately flee, symbolizing the ritualistic breaking of the body's integrity. Then came the removal of the organs. One by one, the lungs, liver, intestines, and stomach would be carefully, yet manually, extracted from the body. Imagine the sticky, tactile sensation of these internal organs, still connected by sinews and membranes, being pulled from the body cavity. The process was messy, involving blood and bodily fluids. Even if the body had been partially drained, you would see the raw viscera, glistening and organic, laid out. The purpose was to prevent decomposition, as these organs, rich in fluid and bacteria, would be the first to rot and destroy the body from the inside. These removed organs weren't discarded. They were themselves vital for the deceased's journey to the afterlife and had to be meticulously preserved separately. Imagine the process: each organ would be carefully washed, often with palm wine for its antiseptic properties and spices. Then they would be dried using natron salt, similar to how the body itself was treated. Finally, they would be placed in canopic jars, often beautifully carved and stoppered with the heads of the four sons of Horus, who protected these specific organs. The liver went into the jar guarded by Imseti human head, the lungs by Hapi baboon head, the stomach by Duamutef jackal head, and the intestines by Kubasenuef falcon head. This careful preservation ensured that the Ka and Ba life force and soul of the deceased would have all their necessary components in the afterlife. Historians still debate the precise ritualistic significance of each specific organ being protected by a distinct deity, and how much it reflected their understanding of anatomy versus religious symbolism. However, the meticulous care taken with the organs is well documented. The smell throughout this evisceration process would be overwhelming. Imagine the combined odors of raw flesh, blood, and the pungent spices and resins used in the washing and drying. The workshop would be filled with a potent, sickly sweet, and undeniably morbid aroma that would cling to your clothes, your skin, and even your hair. You'd likely be fighting nausea, trying to breathe through a piece of perfumed linen, or simply holding your breath when possible. But the stench would be pervasive and inescapable. The heart, however, was usually left in the body. It was considered the center of intelligence, emotion, and memory, crucial for judgment in the afterlife. But its presence meant that even after evisceration, some level of internal decay was still a possibility, leading to the use of further drying agents within the cavity. This process of evisceration, while deeply rooted in religious belief, was a grim and highly unpleasant reality for the embalmers. It required a certain detachment, a professional stoicism in the face of death and decay. You were constantly reminded of the fragile boundary between life and death, and the very physical, messy processes that underpinned their grand beliefs about eternity. So, as you hear the distant whispers of ancient embalming rituals, remember that the journey to the afterlife for the ancient Egyptians involved a visceral, stomach-churning process of organ removal. It was a messy, odorous art, turning the embalmer's workshop into a place of profound biological reality. Far from the serene images of eternal rest, it certainly makes you appreciate modern medical disposal practices and the discreet nature of our farewells, doesn't it? For the ancient Egyptians, holiness began with a very practical and very graphic act of internal cleansing. You've just witnessed the visceral, stomach-churning process of evisceration, a truly graphic step in ancient Egyptian mummification. But even after the internal organs were removed, the most crucial phase of preservation, and one of the most long, smelly, and demanding, awaited natron drying, the scent of desiccation. Forget a quick clinical process. This was a 70-day immersion in salt, turning the corpse into a desiccated husk and filling the embalmer's workshop with an unforgettable aroma. Imagine yourself an assistant in that embalmer's workshop. The body of the deceased, now hollowed out, lies before you. The next critical step is to remove all moisture, as water is the primary agent of decay. This is achieved using natron, a naturally occurring salt found in ancient Egypt. A mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate. It's a powerful drying agent, but its application is anything but pleasant. The body would be completely covered, both inside and out, with vast quantities of dry natron salt. Imagine literally burying the corpse in a mound of this coarse white mineral. The purpose is to draw out all the bodily fluids, effectively dehydrating the tissues. The process is slow, deliberate, and spans approximately 40 days out of the total 70-day mummification period. Imagine returning to the workshop day after day, week after week, watching the body slowly shrivel, darken, and transform into a leathery, almost skeletal form as all moisture is wicked away. The skin would become taut, the features more pronounced, and the body would significantly decrease in size as it lost its water content. A common historical fact is that the 70-day period for mummification was not arbitrary. It corresponded to the time the star Sothis Sirius was absent from the night sky. Linking the embalming process to astronomical observations and religious beliefs about renewal, the smell during these 40 days would be overwhelming and pervasive. While natron itself is a salt, the process of desiccation, especially in the initial stages, would release intense odors from the decaying flesh as the moisture was drawn out. Imagine a powerful, sweet, yet sickly sweet smell of decomposition, mingled with the sharp, mineral scent of the natron itself. This aroma would cling to everything, your clothes, your hair, your skin, permeating the entire workshop and likely extending for a considerable distance around it. You'd try to breathe through perfumed linen, or simply hold your breath when near the body, but the stench would be inescapable, a constant assault on your senses. Beyond the smell, the physical handling of the desiccating body would be constant. The natron would need to be changed periodically, fresh salt applied, and the body carefully turned to ensure even drying. Imagine touching the rough, dry, and often cold surface of the body, feeling its shrinking form. The natron itself could be irritating to the skin, causing dryness or rashes on your hands from constant contact. You are interacting intimately with death, stripped of its initial fluidity, but now a dry, macabre husk. The embalmers often wob priests or specialized artisans, as we discussed, would work in shifts, meticulously overseeing this crucial stage. Any interruption to the drying process, any failure to completely desiccate the body, would result in decomposition, rendering the mummification a failure and jeopardizing the deceased's journey to the afterlife. Imagine the immense pressure of this responsibility, knowing that the eternal fate of a pharaoh or a wealthy noble rested on your diligent, if unpleasant, work. Historians still debate the precise methods of natron application and whether the body was fully immersed in a bath of natron or simply packed with it, as ancient texts provide some ambiguity. However, the desiccation period was undeniably central. This stage of mummification was a profound sensory experience, a daily confrontation with the transformative power of death and preservation. It wasn't just about preserving the physical form, it was about preparing a vessel for the Ka and Ba to return to, a home for eternity. But that profound spiritual purpose was rooted in a very earthly, very smelly, and very physical reality. So, as you hear the distant whispers of ancient rituals, remember that the majestic process of mummification involved a long, intensely odorous period of desiccation. For 40 days, the embalmers and their assistants lived and worked with the overwhelming scent of desiccation, a constant reminder of death's transformation, and the painstaking work required for eternal life. It certainly makes you appreciate modern air conditioning and embalming fluid, doesn't it? For the ancient Egyptians, holiness literally carried a very distinctive and long-lasting smell. You've just been immersed in the long, often overwhelming scent of desiccation, a crucial but unpleasant step in mummification. But even after the body was dried, another truly gruesome, and arguably the nastiest step, remained brain removal. A nasty discovery. Forget sterile procedures, this involved a horrifying, unsanitary method of extracting the brain through the nose, highlighting the brutal realities of ancient embalming. Imagine yourself, an assistant in that embalmer's workshop. The body of the deceased now thoroughly dried by the natron, a leathery husk. The internal organs have been removed, but one crucial organ, the brain, remained. For the ancient Egyptians, the brain was not believed to be important for the afterlife. It was often considered mere cranial stuffing and needed to be removed to prevent putrefaction and preserve the skull. Its removal was purely for practical rather than spiritual reasons. A common historical fact is that while the heart was meticulously preserved and often left in the body, the brain was almost always discarded. The primary method for brain removal was, frankly, horrifying. The embalmer would typically use a long, thin, hooked bronze instrument. Imagine this tool, perhaps resembling a twisted coat hanger or a long, thin spoon, being inserted deep into the deceased's nostril. The goal was to reach the brain, located just above. You visualize the precise yet deeply unsettling maneuver as the instrument is pushed upwards, past the nasal cavity. Once the instrument reached the brain, the process became even more gruesome. The embalmer would then agitate, stir, and effectively liquefy the brain tissue by repeatedly swirling the hook. Imagine the squishing sound, the sensation of manipulating soft tissue through bone. The goal was to break down the delicate brain matter into a semi-liquid state, making it easier to extract. This was a messy, unpleasant, and undeniably stomach-churning task. After the brain was sufficiently liquefied, the body would then be turned onto its side, and the fluid would be allowed to drain out through the nostril. Imagine the sight and sound of brain matter, mixed with fluids, slowly oozing from the nose of the deceased, collected in a basin below. This could take some time, with the embalmer perhaps gently manipulating the head or shaking it to ensure full drainage. The smell, already putrid from the earlier stages of decomposition and the strong natron, would now include the distinctive, sickly sweet odor of decaying brain tissue. You'd likely be fighting nausea, trying to maintain your composure, But the sheer unpleasantness of the task would be overwhelming. The tools used were rudimentary and far from sterile. Imagine reusing the same bronze hooks, perhaps just wiped down from one body to the next. This would undoubtedly contribute to the spread of bacteria and disease, although this was not understood at the time. The entire process was conducted without gloves or modern sanitary precautions, a direct hands-on confrontation with the most unappealing aspects of human anatomy. Archaeologists and medical historians still debate the precise effectiveness of this method in fully removing all brain matter, and whether other methods, such as pouring in hot resin to liquefy the brain, were also commonly used. However, the nasal extraction method is well attested. This gruesome method of brain removal, while efficient for its purpose, stands out as one of the most viscerally unpleasant steps in the entire mummification process. It required an incredibly strong stomach, a profound detachment, and a willingness to engage in tasks that would be utterly horrifying by modern standards. It underscores the pragmatic, almost brutal approach the Egyptians sometimes took to achieving their religious goals of eternal preservation. So, as you hear the distant whispers of ancient embalming secrets, remember that the majestic process of mummification included a truly nasty discovery, the horrifying, unsanitary method of extracting the brain through the nose. It was a messy, odorous, and undeniably gruesome step, highlighting the stark reality behind the grandeur of the afterlife. It certainly makes you profoundly grateful for modern medical and mortuary practices that spare us such visceral details. Doesn't it for the ancient Egyptians? The path to eternity often started with a literal brain drain. You've just witnessed the truly revolting process of brain removal, a nasty discovery in ancient Egyptian mummification. But even after the body was desiccated and the brain extracted, the longest, most meticulous, and arguably most claustrophobic stage awaited wrapping rituals. Endless, stifling linen. Forget a simple shroud. This involved meticulously bandaging the body with hundreds of yards of linen, creating a mummy that was as much a sealed, textile cocoon as it was a preserved corpse. Imagine yourself an assistant in the embalmer's workshop. The air now dry but still carrying the lingering scent of natron and spices. The body, now a shriveled, leathery husk, has undergone all the internal preparations. Now begins the painstaking process of wrapping, a ritual that could take up to 15 days of the total 70-day mummification period, consuming vast quantities of precious linen. A common historical fact is that archaeologists have found mummies wrapped in layers totaling hundreds of square meters of linen. Your first task is to apply layers of resin and oils to the body. Imagine the sticky, fragrant substances being carefully smeared over the desiccated skin, helping to seal and protect it. This acts as an adhesive for the first layers of linen, but also adds to the overall stickiness and the distinct aroma of the workshop. Then comes the actual wrapping, a meticulous, repetitive, and utterly demanding process. You're not just throwing on bandages, every finger and toe is wrapped individually. Then the limbs, then the torso, in multiple layers. Imagine taking long strips of linen, carefully torn or cut to precise widths, and painstakingly wrapping them around the body, ensuring there are no gaps, no loose ends, no imperfections. You're working in a confined space, often bending over the body for hours on end, your hands cramping from the repetitive motions. The linen itself, though clean, would shed fibers, making the air dusty and potentially irritating your lungs. Between the layers of linen, amulets and charms would be carefully placed. Imagine small, intricately carved scarab beetles, ankh symbols, or figures of protective deities being inserted between the bandages at specific points on the body. Each amulet had a precise magical purpose, meant to protect the deceased on their perilous journey through the underworld. You'd have to place them perfectly, ensuring they were secure and facing the correct direction. Knowing their magical efficacy depended on your precision. This added another layer of meticulousness and spiritual responsibility to an already arduous task. Historians still debate the precise magical significance of each amulet's placement and whether the embalmers fully understood the spells associated with each. However, their ritual importance is well documented. As the layers accumulated, the body would transform from a shriveled husk into a more human-like yet utterly rigid form. Imagine the sheer volume of linen, slowly building up, creating a thick, solid cocoon around the corpse. The final outer layers would be vast sheets of linen, often decorated or painted, forming a smooth, pristine outer shell. This transformation was visually remarkable, turning the gruesome reality of a corpse into a serene, almost artistic representation of eternal life. The claustrophobic aspect of this process, even for the embalmers, is notable. You are working closely, intimately, with a body that is being increasingly sealed off from the outside world. The room would feel increasingly closed in, the air perhaps stifling despite efforts at ventilation. As you created this airtight, lightless casing, the smell of the resins in the body, though fading, would be completely encapsulated within the linen, intensifying the enclosed atmosphere. The final stage of wrapping often involved a shroud or a final sheet, carefully placed and perhaps secured with additional bandages. This final layer often bore painted or gilded decorations, including the face of the deceased, making the mummy visually complete. It was the culmination of weeks of painstaking, often unpleasant, labor, transforming a dead body into a sacred object, ready for its tomb. So, as you hear the distant rustle of an imaginary linen bandage, remember that the majestic appearance of an ancient Egyptian mummy was the result of an incredibly tedious, physically demanding, and claustrophobic process. It involved endless wrapping, meticulous placement of amulets, and a profound dedication to ritual precision, turning a corpse into a textile cocoon for eternity. It certainly makes you appreciate modern methods of preservation that don't involve hundreds of yards of fabric, doesn't it? For the ancient Egyptians, the path to eternal life was literally wrapped in endless, stifling linen. You've just been encased in the endless, stifling linen of the wrapping rituals, a meticulous and claustrophobic step in mummy creation. But once the deceased was a fully formed mummy, the ordeal for the living was far from over. Now, prepare to experience the very public, often loud and emotionally raw reality of the funerary procession. Public grief and display. Forget quiet. Dignified farewells. An ancient Egyptian funeral was a physically demanding spectacle of organized lamentation. Designed to showcase wealth and ensure the deceased's passage to the afterlife, imagine yourself, not as a mourner, but as a participant in a grand funeral procession. The air is thick, not just with the dry desert dust, but with the cloying scent of frankincense and other resins burned as offerings. You hear the rhythmic, mournful chants of priests, mingling with the piercing, almost unsettling wails of professional mourners. This isn't a quiet affair. It's a cacophony of orchestrated grief designed to impress both the living and the gods. A common historical fact is that professional mourners, particularly women known as kites of Nephthys, were an integral part of high-status funeral processions, mimicking the lamentations of goddesses. The centerpiece of the procession is the sarcophagus, holding the mummy. It's often incredibly heavy, made of stone or elaborately decorated wood, and would be transported on a sledge pulled by oxen or a large team of men. Imagine the immense physical effort involved in pulling this colossal weight through the uneven streets and across the desert floor under the relentless Egyptian sun. The dust would rise in clouds, coating everyone and everything. You might be part of the dragging team, straining your muscles, feeling the ropes bite into your shoulders, or you might be one of the many attendants accompanying the procession, enduring the heat and the slow pace. Accompanying the sarcophagus were various funerary offerings. You'd see chests filled with grave goods, canopic jars containing the organs, and models of boats, houses, and servants, all the necessities for the deceased's afterlife journey. Imagine this vast array of wealth being paraded publicly, a clear display of the deceased's status and the family's piety. It was a procession of possessions, emphasizing the deceased's earthly identity as they transition to the eternal realm. Then there were the professional mourners. These women, often depicted in tomb paintings, would tear at their hair, beat their breasts, and smear their faces with mud or dust, emitting piercing wails and laments. Imagine the raw, visceral sounds of their grief, amplified and sustained, creating an overwhelming atmosphere of sorrow. While some personal grief was undoubtedly real, this was a highly ritualized, almost theatrical performance designed to impress the gods and ensure the deceased was properly lamented. Their public display of anguish was designed to be contagious, encouraging genuine tears from onlookers. Historians still debate the precise balance between genuine grief and ritual performance in ancient Egyptian funerals. Noting that social expectations played a significant role, the procession was also a symbolic journey, often stopping at various points for rituals and prayers. It could be long, stretching for miles, from the deceased's home across the Nile to the Western Bank, the land of the dead. Imagine the physical exhaustion of this slow, mournful march, enduring the heat, the dust, and the constant emotional intensity of the lamentations. There was no comfortable seating. You were on your feet for hours, participating in this arduous farewell. For the family of the deceased, the emotional burden was immense. They were at the center of this public display, expected to show appropriate grief while also managing the complex logistics of the procession. Imagine performing your profound personal sorrow while simultaneously being acutely aware of social expectations and the critical role this ritual played in securing your loved one's afterlife. The purpose of this public display was multifaceted. It was a ritualistic separation of the deceased from the living world, a public acknowledgement of their death, and a collective prayer for their safe passage to the field of reeds. It was also a demonstration of the family's wealth and status, reinforcing their position within society even in death. The more elaborate and costly the funeral, the greater the prestige for the surviving family. So, as you hear the distant echoes of solemn chants and mournful wails, remember that for the ancient Egyptians, a funeral was not a private affair but a physically demanding, emotionally charged, and meticulously orchestrated public spectacle. It was a loud, dusty, and sometimes exhausting journey, designed to guide the deceased to eternity while simultaneously displaying the power and piety of the living. It certainly makes you appreciate a quieter, more personal funeral service, doesn't it? For the ancient Egyptians, grief was a public performance and eternity, a heavy journey. You've just been part of the loud, emotionally charged spectacle of an ancient Egyptian funerary procession, a physically demanding public display. But even after that exhausting journey, the most critical and often precarious leg of the deceased's eternal voyage remained the perilous tomb journey. Forget smoothly paved roads. Transporting the colossal sarcophagus and countless grave goods to the burial site, often a hidden chamber deep within the desert or a massive pyramid, was a logistical nightmare fraught with danger, potential accidents, and the constant threat of tomb robbers. Imagine yourself, now as a member of the funerary team, perhaps overseeing the transport of the massive sarcophagus. The procession has reached the edge of the desert, or perhaps the foot of a rocky cliff leading to a necropolis like the Valley of the Kings. The real challenge begins here. The terrain is no longer the relatively flat, cultivated land of the Nile Valley. It's rough, uneven, and often steep. The sarcophagus, often carved from solid stone like granite or quartzite, could weigh many tons. Imagine the immense physical effort required to maneuver this colossal weight up sandy slopes, over rocky outcrops, or through narrow, winding desert paths. It would be placed on a sturdy wooden sledge, pulled by dozens, perhaps hundreds of laborers, straining against heavy ropes under the brutal Egyptian sun. The air is thick with dust kicked up by countless feet and the grinding of the sledge over the rough ground. You hear the grunts of the laborers, the rhythmic chants designed to coordinate their efforts, and the shouts of overseers. A common historical fact is that the sheer scale of the stone used in Egyptian monuments and sarcophagi required immense organized labor and engineering prowess. The journey to the tomb was inherently fraught with danger. Imagine the ropes snapping under the immense strain, sending the sarcophagus careening down a slope, or crushing any unfortunate laborers in its path. A slip, a loss of footing on the uneven terrain, could lead to a catastrophic accident, not just damaging the precious coffin, but fatally injuring the workers. You'd be constantly vigilant, watching for loose stones, uneven ground, or signs of fatigue among the pulling team. The very ground beneath your feet felt precarious. Beyond the weight of the sarcophagus, there were countless funerary offerings that also needed to be transported. Imagine hundreds of chests filled with gold, jewels, furniture, and provisions, along with canopic jars, shabti figures, and various ritual objects. Each piece was valuable, delicate, and essential for the deceased's afterlife. These would be carried by smaller teams or on donkeys, but each step was still a risk. A stumble could shatter a precious vase. A fall could damage a golden statue, compromising the deceased's eternal well-being. Historians still debate the precise logistical challenges of transporting goods to the Valley of the Kings, given its remote and rugged nature, but it was undoubtedly a monumental task. And then there was the ever-present threat of tomb robbers. This journey, often taking place over exposed terrain, was a prime opportunity for opportunistic thieves. Imagine knowing that armed bandits could emerge from the desert at any moment, eager to seize the valuable grave goods before they were sealed away. While armed guards would accompany the procession, their numbers could be limited, and the vastness of the desert offered many hiding places for potential attackers. This added a layer of acute anxiety to an already physically demanding task, forcing constant vigilance. The destination itself, the tomb, was often hidden and difficult to access. If it was a rock-cut tomb, you would then have to maneuver the massive sarcophagus through narrow, winding passages, down steep ramps, and around tight corners, all in dim torchlight. Imagine the sheer difficulty of sliding tons of stone through confined spaces, using levers and brute force, inches away from the precious mummy inside. Every scratch, every bump, was a potential desecration. The entire tomb journey was a grueling, high-stakes endeavor. Failure meant not just physical injury or loss of treasure, but a spiritual catastrophe for the deceased, hindering their path to eternity. The physical effort, the constant danger, and the meticulous care required transformed the final journey to the tomb into a true ordeal, demanding immense human labor and unwavering dedication. So, as you hear the distant rumble of an imaginary heavy stone being dragged, remember that for the ancient Egyptians, the path to eternal rest was paved with immense physical effort and constant peril. Transporting the deceased to their final resting place was a perilous tomb journey, a high-stakes logistical nightmare fraught with the danger of accidents and the constant threat of those who would desecrate the dead. It certainly makes you appreciate modern hearse services and climate-controlled mausoleums. Doesn't it for the ancient Egyptians? Eternity truly began with a heavy, dangerous, and very public lift. You've just navigated the arduous and dangerous tomb journey, a final, perilous trek to the deceased's eternal resting place. But once the sarcophagus was finally in position, the culmination of the entire funerary process, and one of the most psychologically chilling acts, awaited tomb sealing, buried alive symbolically. Forget a simple closing of a door. This involved meticulously and permanently sealing off the tomb, a claustrophobic act designed to ensure eternal rest, but which also carried a profound psychological impact of finality and utter confinement. Imagine yourself as an embalmer, a priest, or a high-ranking official standing in the burial chamber. The massive stone sarcophagus, holding the precious mummy, is now in its final resting place. The countless grave goods, from gold and jewels to furniture and food, meticulously arranged around it. This chamber, intended to be the deceased's eternal home, now needs to be sealed permanently. The process began by closing the sarcophagus itself. Imagine the grinding sound as the colossal stone lid, often weighing many tons, was slowly lowered and slid into place over the lower section. This was a precise operation, requiring immense brute force and careful guidance to ensure a perfect fit. The sound of the stone grinding against stone, slowly sealing off the mummy from all light and air, would be deeply symbolic and unsettling. A final farewell to the physical presence of the deceased. A common historical fact is that sarcophagi lids were so heavy and well fitted that they created a nearly airtight seal, further emphasizing the finality. But that was just the beginning. The entire burial chamber, and often the passages leading to it, would then be meticulously sealed with stone blocks. Imagine massive stone slabs, precisely cut, being hauled into position and mortared into place, one after another. You'd hear the heavy thud as each block settled, the rhythmic chipping of tools as the masons worked, and the soft rasp of mortar being applied. This wasn't just about security, it was about creating an impenetrable barrier between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. For tombs with complex designs, like the pyramids or the rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the ceiling involved intricate, multi-layered systems. There might be portcullises, massive stone slabs that could be dropped from above, instantly blocking a passage. Imagine the terrifying roar as such a block descended, severing the path back to the outside world. There could be false walls, cunningly constructed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding rock, hiding the true entrance to the burial chamber. You, as one of the last living people inside, would witness these intricate traps being activated, knowing that if you were to somehow be left behind, your fate would be sealed, quite literally met within these stone walls. The claustrophobic aspect of this final sealing would be immense. As the passages narrow and the stone blocks rise, the air would become still and heavy. The light from your lamps or torches diminishing with each newly added barrier, you would be one of the last to exit, perhaps backing out through a narrow crawl space, feeling the stone press in on all sides. Imagine the profound sense of finality, the weight of tons of rock settling around you, as the last sliver of light from the outside world disappears. The tomb, for the deceased, was an eternal home for any living person left inside. It would be a terrifying, airless coffin. Historians still debate the precise ritualistic significance of these sealing processes, with some arguing they were as much about spiritual separation as physical security. The psychological impact of witnessing this final entombment would be profound. You are physically closing off the deceased from all earthly contact, condemning them to eternal darkness and solitude. This act served as a powerful reminder of mortality, the finality of death, and the irreversible journey to the afterlife. It was a solemn, chilling ritual, emphasizing the absolute barrier between the living and the dead. And for the workers themselves, the very ones who created and sealed these tombs, there was the constant, unspoken threat of being deliberately trapped inside to guard the treasures. While direct historical evidence for mass live burial of workers is rare for this period, the fear was undoubtedly real, contributing to the chilling atmosphere of the tomb sealing process. The secrets of the tomb were so vital that their human cost was sometimes measured in lives. So, as you hear the distant echoes of stone grinding on stone, remember that for the ancient Egyptians, the act of tomb sealing was not just a practical matter of security. It was a meticulous, psychologically chilling ritual of entombment, forcing the deceased into eternal darkness and confinement, and leaving the living with a profound sense of finality and the chilling reminder of absolute separation. It certainly makes you appreciate a simple, visible gravestone, doesn't it? For the ancient Egyptians, the dead were truly, terrifyingly buried alive. You've just been part of the terrifying act of tomb sealing, a claustrophobic and psychologically profound moment of finality. But all this elaborate, painstaking effort, all this meticulous ritual and immense construction, came at an astronomical price. Now, prepare to explore the cost a lifetime of savings gone, discovering the immense financial burden of ensuring a proper, elaborate ancient Egyptian funeral, a cost that could bankrupt families and consume the wealth of generations. Imagine yourself as an ancient Egyptian noble or a wealthy official, perhaps even a pharaoh contemplating your own mortality. The afterlife is paramount, and ensuring your eternal well-being requires a proper burial. But that means investing a colossal fortune, often accumulated over your entire lifetime, into your tomb and funerary preparations. This wasn't a casual expense, it was the single largest investment most Egyptians would ever make, far exceeding the cost of their earthly homes. The first major expense was the tomb itself. For the wealthy, this meant commissioning a rock-cut tomb in a necropolis, building a mastaba, or even contributing to a pyramid complex. Imagine the cost of hiring skilled stonemasons, sculptors, painters, and laborers for decades. The raw materials alone, vast quantities of stone, plaster, and pigments, were incredibly expensive. And the sheer scale of the labor involved, requiring supervision, tools, and food for thousands of workers over many years, was staggering. You were essentially building your eternal mansion, and the price tag reflected it. A common historical fact is that the construction of even modest rock-cut tombs could take years and consume significant family resources. Then came the mummification process. As we've explored, this was a complex 70-day ordeal, requiring specialized priests and vast quantities of expensive materials. Imagine the cost of high-quality natron salt, imported resins like frankincense and myrrh from distant lands, fragrant oils, and hundreds of yards of pristine linen bandages. These were not local, cheap commodities. The more elaborate the mummification, the higher the price, with the most elite methods costing an immense sum. You were literally paying for your body to be preserved for eternity, a costly investment in immortality. Beyond the body, there were the sarcophagi and coffins. A wealthy individual might have multiple layers of coffins, an inner wooden coffin, perhaps gilded, encased in an outer stone sarcophagus, intricately carved and painted. Imagine the cost of quarrying and transporting massive blocks of stone, then hiring skilled craftsmen to carve and decorate them over months or years. These were not just containers, they were works of art, designed to last for millennia. And their price reflected the immense labor and precious materials. Historians still debate the precise economic impact of funerary expenses on ancient Egyptian society, but it's clear a significant portion of national wealth was channeled into mortuary cults. The grave goods themselves represented a colossal financial outflow. The deceased was buried with everything they would need for the afterlife: furniture, jewelry, clothing, cosmetics, tools, and vast quantities of food and drink. For pharaohs, this included unimaginable riches like gold masks, chariots, and weapons. Even for nobles, the sheer volume of precious objects interred with them represented a lifetime of accumulated wealth, removed from circulation. Imagine spending your entire life acquiring treasures, only to have them all buried with you. A massive financial sacrifice for the sake of the afterlife. Then there was the funeral procession itself. This involved hiring professional mourners, providing food and drink for attendees, and organizing the logistical nightmare of transporting the sarcophagus and goods to the tomb. Imagine paying for oxen, sledges, and hundreds of laborers for this public display. The more extravagant the funeral, the greater the cost, driven by a desire to demonstrate status and piety. And the expenses didn't end with the burial. There was the ongoing cost of the mortuary cult. Your tomb would require a dedicated staff of priests to perform daily rituals, offer food and prayers, and maintain your eternal cult. This meant setting up an endowment, vast tracts of land or regular payments, to ensure these services continued for generations. Imagine dedicating a significant portion of your family's future income to maintaining your post-mortem well-being. This created a long-term financial drain, often leading to neglect of cults over time as family fortunes dwindled. The psychological burden of this immense financial commitment was profound. You spent your entire life accumulating wealth, not for personal comfort in this life, But for the abstract promise of eternal prosperity in the next, imagine working tirelessly, saving every scrap, denying yourself pleasures, all for a future you wouldn't personally experience. It was a gamble on eternity, a massive investment of resources based on unwavering faith. So, as you hear the distant echoes of ancient gold clinking, remember that for the ancient Egyptians, ensuring a proper journey to the afterlife came at an astronomical price. Their elaborate funerals were a lifetime of savings gone, consuming vast fortunes and diverting immense resources to the dead, often at the expense of the living. It certainly makes you appreciate more affordable and less demanding funeral customs, doesn't it? For the ancient Egyptians, eternal life was incredibly expensive. You've just explored the astronomical financial burden of ancient Egyptian funerals, a cost that consumed lifetimes of savings for the promise of eternity. But even after the immense expenses, the construction, the mummification, and the burial were complete, the duties for the living and the associated costs were far from over. Now, let's reflect on post-burial rituals' endless obligations, discovering the continuous duties and recurring expenses that stretched long after the deceased was interred, ensuring their eternal well-being, but demanding ceaseless effort from their descendants. Imagine yourself as a surviving family member of a wealthy Egyptian noble. The grand funeral is over, the tomb is sealed, and your loved one is theoretically at rest. But their journey to the afterlife and their continued prosperity there depended on a constant stream of rituals and offerings from the living. Your obligations to the deceased were perpetual, stretching across generations. The most fundamental post-burial duty was the daily provision of offerings. Imagine making daily trips to the tomb, or sending dedicated priests to place fresh food, water, beer, and flowers on the offering table in the tomb chapel. These weren't just symbolic gestures, they were believed to be literal nourishment for the Ka life force of the deceased. Imagine the time commitment, the logistical effort, and the constant expense of providing these perishable goods. Day after day, year after year. Any lapse in these offerings could mean the deceased would suffer hunger and thirst in the afterlife. A terrifying prospect. A common historical fact is that tomb chapels often had false doors or offering tables to facilitate these regular provisions for the deceased's kai. Beyond daily offerings, there were regular rituals and prayers that needed to be performed by designated priests or family members within the tomb chapel. These rituals, sometimes intricate and requiring specific incantations, were vital to ensure the deceased's continued existence and prosperity in the field of reeds. Imagine dedicating a portion of your day, perhaps several times a week, to solemn rituals for your ancestors, ensuring their spiritual well-being. This was a direct, ongoing responsibility that could not be neglected. The maintenance of the tomb itself was another continuous obligation and expense. Tombs, especially rock-cut tombs or mastabas, were susceptible to damage from the elements, sand accumulation, or even minor earthquakes. Imagine hiring stonemasons or laborers to clear sand from the entrance, repair crumbling masonry, or repaint faded inscriptions. The constant vigilance against tomb robbers also required periodic checks, ensuring the seals remained intact and the hidden passages undisturbed. This was a perpetual battle against time and decay, designed to protect the deceased's eternal home. Historians still debate the specific economic models for how mortuary cults were sustained over long periods, especially beyond the initial family's wealth, often involving endowments or dedicated priestly estates. For those with significant means, a dedicated mortuary cult staff of priests would be established. These priests would be paid through endowments, specific lands, revenues, or resources set aside by the deceased during their lifetime to fund their cult in perpetuity. Imagine your family's land generating income not just for the living, but to maintain a full-time staff dedicated to serving your deceased ancestor. If these endowments dwindled due to economic hardship, or if the family's fortunes declined, the maintenance of the cult would suffer, potentially jeopardizing the deceased's afterlife. This created a long-term financial burden that could span generations. The psychological burden of these endless obligations was profound. You lived with the constant responsibility of ensuring your ancestors' eternal well-being. Any misfortune in the family, illness, financial ruin, or lack of heirs, could be attributed to a failure in maintaining the mortuary cult, leading to immense guilt and anxiety. Imagine the pressure of knowing that your own actions, or lack thereof, could condemn your beloved ancestors to a miserable existence in the afterlife. This instilled a deep sense of duty, but also a pervasive anxiety. Ultimately, the ancient Egyptian funeral was not a final goodbye. It was the beginning of an endless series of obligations. The deceased never truly left the family. They merely transitioned to a different form of existence, one that demanded continuous support and immense resources from their living descendants. This cycle of service ensured the longevity of their mortuary beliefs, but placed a constant, long-term burden on the living. So, as you drift off to sleep, remember that for the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end of duty, but the beginning of an eternal cycle of reciprocal obligations between the living and the dead. Their elaborate funerals were just the start of endless post-burial rituals, demanding continuous effort and immense resources from their families for generations. It certainly makes you appreciate a simple, final farewell, doesn't it? For the ancient Egyptians, eternity truly came with endless strings attached. You have come full circle in exploring the lesser-known aspects of ancient Egyptian funerals. We have gone through the gruesome mummification, the messy and smelly organ extraction, the long, drawn-out drying of natron, the gruesome brain removal, the endless suffocating wrapping rituals, the loud and emotional public funerals, the dangerous journey to the tomb, the haunting tomb sealing rituals, the enormous expense that consumed a lifetime, and finally the endless duties that followed burial. As you drift off to sleep, let the image of the unending devotion to the dead, the elaborate rituals, and the burdens they placed on the living fade away. It is a poignant reminder that, even with a belief in eternal life, the journey to the afterlife is a heavy burden for both the dead and those left behind.